The chandeliers glittered like frozen fireworks above the dining room, their crystals catching every flicker of light and scattering it across white linen tables. The air smelled of aged wine and roasted lamb, with a faint trace of perfume from the women gliding past in designer gowns. Conversation hummed like background music, steady and controlled, punctuated by bursts of laughter that never reached the eyes. It was a room designed to remind people that they had made it, that wealth itself was the performance. Naomi Williams stood just beyond the double doors that separated the chaos of the kitchen from this carefully curated world. She straightened her uniform, running her hands over the crisp white shirt and black vest, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there. The mirror beside the staff lockers had told her she looked fine, but fine wasn't enough here. Here, perfection was the price of survival. One dropped glass, one misstep, one mistake too visible, and she could lose the job that paid the rent, bought the school supplies, and kept the lights burning in her tiny apartment across town. Her daughter's photo was tucked safely inside her phone case, the edges worn from her fingers tracing it during breaks. Isla, 7 years old, braids tied with pink ribbons, her smile wide enough to erase every disappointment Naomi had carried since she was her daughter's age. Tonight Naomi had promised her they'd read a chapter of her favorite book before bed. That promise sat heavy in her chest because she knew a shift like this could easily stretch past midnight. She adjusted the bun at the back of her head until it pulled tight enough to sting. Presentation mattered here. Everything mattered. Being a black woman in a place like this meant walking an invisible tightrope. The customers never remembered her name, but they noticed everything else. The shine of her shoes, the pine pitch of her voice, the steadiness of her hands. Perfection wasn't about praise. Perfection was about not giving them a reason to dismiss her. The kitchen door swung open, releasing a wave of heat and noise. James, the head waiter, slipped out, his expression tight. He scanned the staff gathered near the service station and lowered his voice, though not enough to keep the words from racing down the line like wildfire. "He's coming," James said. "A Japanese millionaire. Tonight." Naomi felt the ripple travel through the room. Waiters exchanged glances. Someone dropped a fork and cursed under their breath. Madison, the hostess, whispered something about international investors, her voice trembling with both fear and excitement. No one knew what he wanted, only that his presence mattered. In a restaurant where the elite came to prove their importance, a guest who could silence the room without saying a word was either a blessing or a curse. Naomi's stomach tightened. She pulled in a slow breath, steadying herself the way she had every night for the past 6 years. This was her world, her cage of glass and linen, where she was expected to be silent but flawless, present but unseen. And yet something in the way the rumor spread tonight felt different. It carried the weight of something bigger than food or service, something that might decide more than just tips or schedules. The chandeliers glittered overhead, unaware of the storm building beneath them. And Naomi, clutching her tray like armor, stepped into the dining room, unaware that before the night was over, her daughter would walk through those doors and change everything. The dining room already felt charged when the doors opened. A hush spread like ripples in water, soft but unmistakable. Forks paused midway to mouths. Glasses froze just shy of lips. Even the waitstaff seemed to slow their movements, as though the air itself had thickened. He had arrived. The man stepped in with a presence that was neither rushed nor hesitant. He moved as though time belonged to him and bent itself around his steps. His suit was a shade of charcoal so deep it seemed to absorb the glow of the chandeliers. No ostentatious logos, no loud displays, just quiet, absolute confidence stitched into every line of fabric. His hair, dark with silver strands, was pulled neatly back, not a strand out of place. His shoes didn't squeak or click. They simply belonged to the floor the way ocean waves belong to the shore. Naomi had seen senators, billionaires, and movie stars cross this threshold. Some demanded attention, waving credit cards like weapons. Some dripped with entitlement as if the chandeliers existed solely to spotlight their arrival. But this man was different. His silence carried more weight than their shouting ever had. Madison, the hostess, nearly fumbled her reservation tablet. Her practiced smile quivered at the edges as she stepped forward. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Lou Bernardine. Do you have a reservation?" The man inclined his head just slightly before answering. His voice was soft, yet carried through the room like silk sliding over glass. Japanese words, smooth and rhythmic, spilled into the air. Naomi didn't need to understand the language to hear the expectation inside it. Madison's smile faltered. She blinked once, twice, as if trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Then she cast a panicked glance toward the manager's office. Within seconds, Richard Carroll emerged. He always came quickly when there was money to impress. His smile was too bright, his handshake too rehearsed, his voice too loud. Welcome, welcome. We are honored to have you with us tonight. He spread his arms like a preacher on Sunday, as if volume alone could erase the awkwardness forming in the air. The guest replied calmly, again in Japanese, his words patient but edged with precision, the syllables lilted, with dignity, not arrogance. The room leaned in unconsciously, straining to understand. Carol's smile tightened. Ah, yes, of course. He gestured vaguely toward Madison and James, who had appeared at his side. Do we have anyone who speaks Japanese? Blank stares. Someone muttered about French, another about Italian. Spanish was mentioned, but Japanese? Nothing. The truth settled like a stone in water. No one here could understand him. The whispering began, guests leaning across tables, their voices sharp enough to pierce. This is embarrassing. A restaurant of this level and not a single Japanese speaker? Perhaps he's testing them. You know how these people are. Naomi, carrying a tray of wine glasses, caught fragments of their laughter. It stung in a way she knew too well, not because the words were aimed at her, but because cruelty always carried the same tone, the same dismissive cadence. She remembered sitting in classrooms where professors assumed she didn't belong, job interviews where her accent or her skin seemed to disqualify her before she even spoke. At the center table, the man waited, still, silent, watching the room with eyes that betrayed nothing yet saw everything. His composure never cracked, but Naomi noticed the smallest shift in his shoulders, a subtle tension. Patience had its limits. Carol hissed at James through clenched teeth. Get him seated. Table 7, the best. Keep him here until we figure this out. James nodded and hurried forward, guiding the man to the golden center of the room. Table 7 gleamed beneath the chandelier's most flattering light. It was the stage of the restaurant, the place where reputations were displayed like fine china. The guest followed, still unhurried, still composed, as if the entire dining room were a stage and he the only actor who remembered his lines. From the kitchen doors, Naomi watched him. Sit, hands folded, gaze steady. She'd served countless guests who barked orders, snapped fingers, waved their wealth like a weapon. But this man had said only a few words, and already the room felt like a theater waiting for its next act. And in that silence, a truth pressed down on her chest. Whatever happened at that table tonight would not be ordinary. The kitchen pulsed like a beating heart behind Naomi, heat and voices overlapping in frantic rhythm. Orders barked across the pass, plates rattled, and the scent of seared lamb and buttered scallops clung to the air, yet none of it mattered as much as what waited just beyond the double doors. Table 7, the guest everyone whispered about, the man who spoke and no one understood. Naomi leaned against the counter for a single breath, just long enough to steady her nerves. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She slipped it out, careful to shield the screen from anyone's eyes. A picture from Mrs. Patterson next door filled it. Isla curled on the couch, a book balanced on her knees, her braids falling into her face. Relief bloomed in Naomi's chest. At least her daughter was safe tonight. That was all that mattered. She slid the phone away, tugged her vest straight, and pressed her lips together until the lines of worry disappeared. Out there, she had no space to be human, no space to be tired, to be worried, to be anything but polished perfection. Out there, she was the server, nothing more. James swept through the door, his face flushed. Naomi, you're on 7. Her stomach sank. Me? He raked a hand through his gelled hair, breaking the neat lines into messy streaks. No one else. He's making Carol sweat bullets. If this goes wrong, heads will roll. Just smile, nod, be perfect. God knows we can't afford to lose him. Naomi didn't argue. In this place, choice wasn't part of the uniform. She set a tray of sparkling water onto her palm, adjusted the balance with the ease of 15 years' practice, and walked toward the dining room. As she shumo, he pushed through the doors. The shift in atmosphere hit her. The chatter that usually swirled like champagne bubbles had thinned into sharp whispers. Every gaze tugged toward table 7. The man sat in the golden pool of candlelight, unmoving, his stillness louder than the room's nervous noise. He might have been carved from stone, except for the subtle flicker of his eyes as they scanned the menu, then the staff, then the room that failed him. Naomi walked with measured grace, her shoes whispering across marble tiles. She could feel the eyes of the wealthy following her, not with admiration but with curiosity sharpened into judgment. It was always like this, a black waitress in a white linen temple. Every step felt like a test she hadn't agreed to take. She stopped at the table and set down the glass with flawless precision. Not a drop spilled. Good evening, sir. Welcome to Lou Bernardine. she said softly, every syllable rehearsed until it rang like music. For the first time, the man's gaze lifted. His eyes met hers, dark, unreadable, but not dismissive. For just a flicker, she saw something that looked like relief. Then he spoke, his words flowing in Japanese, gentle but insistent. The sounds fell over her like rain, beautiful, musical, and utterly foreign. She caught nothing, not a single word. Her smile held, practiced and professional, though her pulse quickened in her throat. She tried again. Perhaps you'd like to see our specials menu? He paused, studied her face, then spoke again, slower this time, as if simplicity might bridge the void between them. Still, the meaning was lost. Conversations around the room softened, guests leaning closer, pretending not to watch but unable to look away. Naomi felt the weight of their amusement pressing down on her. To them, this was entertainment, a scene unfolding for their consumption, where failure was inevitable. And humiliation inevitable too. From across the room, she heard it, a woman's whisper, just loud enough to carry, "Embarrassing, a place like this, and no one can understand him." Her companion's reply cut sharper. "Maybe he's testing them. That's what real investors do. Everything is a game." Naomi kept her eyes on the man, but the words burned. She'd heard them before, spoken in different ways at different times. College classrooms where professors wondered if she'd earned her seat. Interviews where they decided before she opened her mouth that she wasn't what they were looking for. Always a test. Always a game she was never meant to win. The man's eyes flickered toward the whispering table, catching their judgment mid-air. He said nothing, but Naomi saw it, his patience thinning, frustration slipping through the cracks of his composure. He looked around as though reconsidering his choice to stay. Her heart clenched. If he stood up, if he left, the fallout would be brutal. Carol would blame her, James, everyone. People like her couldn't afford to be associated with failure. She forced her smile wider, even as her insides twisted. She didn't know then that this moment, the weight of silence, the threat of collapse, was only the beginning. Before the night was over, her daughter would step into this room and turn everything upside down. The hum of the restaurant had shifted. It wasn't the usual rhythm of laughter, clinking glasses, and murmured conversations. It was sharper now, tinged with cruelty, a theater of whispers disguised as dinner. The air itself seemed to lean toward table 7, where the Japanese guest sat in composed silence, his eyes betraying little, though his patience thinned like paper held too close to flame. Naomi stood beside him with a practiced smile plastered on her face, her tray steady, though her fingers ached from gripping it too tightly. She had tried every trick she knew, pointing at the menu, gesturing delicately, speaking slowly in English and French. But his words remained a mystery, flowing like water she could not cup in her hands. Behind her, she heard it. A laugh, soft, but cruel enough to pierce. She turned her head slightly, not enough to break her posture, but enough to see where it came from. Marcus Whitfield, a man who wore his wealth the way others wore armor, leaned back in his chair, his gold cufflinks catching the light as if they, too, demanded attention. "This is what happens when standards drop," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "They let anyone work here. Look at this mess. He probably doesn't even know which fork to use." Patricia, his wife, giggled behind a manicured hand, her pearls trembling with the motion. "New money," she said. "They always look so serious, so important, until you realize they can't even order dinner." Another guest chimed in, his words dripping with disdain. "Real wealth speaks the language of wherever it travels. If he can't, then what's he doing here?" The laughter rippled across the room, subtle but poisonous, weaving through the candlelight and crystal until the restaurant itself seemed to sneer. Naomi felt the sting as though each word had been aimed at her. She had lived this tone all her life, the mocking dismissal, the quiet degradation dressed in polite laughter. It wasn't about the man at table 7, not really. It was about power, about how easy it was to strip dignity from someone when the room believed they didn't belong. The Japanese guest, still seated with perfect posture, let the comments wash over him. Yet Naomi saw the change. His shoulders, once relaxed, had stiffened. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered for a fraction of a second toward the whisperers. He knew. He understood. Even if he hadn't grasped every word, he recognized tone. Cruelty didn't need translation. Naomi's chest tightened. She wanted to defend him, to shield him from the room's daggers, but she knew the rules. Her job was not to speak. Her job was to serve, to be invisible, even as injustice burned hot against her skin. Richard Carril appeared then, the restaurant's owner, his smile stretched so wide it seemed to pain him. "Is everything satisfactory, sir?" he asked, speaking slowly and loudly, as if sheer volume might bridge the language barrier. "The food, very good, best in city." The guest regarded him with cool detachment before replying in Japanese, his tone polite, but carrying an edge Naomi could sense even without understanding the words. Carril's grin faltered, a crack in his polished mask, before he turned sharply to Naomi. "What has he ordered?" Naomi's stomach dropped. "Nothing yet, Mr. Carril. We're still—" "There's a language barrier," Carril hissed, his voice sharp enough to cut. "Figure it out. Do you understand what this could mean for us?" She swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly, though she kept them steady against the tray. She wanted to scream that understanding required more than perfection, more than fake smiles and nodding heads, but she bit her tongue. This job was her lifeline. Isla's school fees, the electricity bill, the winter coat she'd promised her daughter, everything hung on this fragile balance. The man at table 7, sensing the storm around him, shifted in his chair. He reached for his coat. He was preparing to leave. Panic rippled through the staff. James, the head waiter, rushed forward with a bottle of wine, words tumbling out in a frantic attempt to please. "Perhaps you'd enjoy our Chateau d'Yquem, sir. Exceptional vintage." The guest shook his head, his voice sharper now in Japanese. His hand gestured toward the wine list, dismissive, final. James's persistence only deepened the crack in his composure. Conv. Conversations around the room swelled again, diners leaning closer, their whispers no longer subtle. "He's insulted. They're losing him. What a disaster." Naomi stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the expression on the guest's face, the look of someone realizing they had been misjudged, unwelcome, dismissed. She had worn that look herself too many times, in job interviews, in classrooms, in rooms where her presence was tolerated but never embraced. And then, the moment of collapse came. The guest rose from his chair, his coat sliding over one arm. The hush that fell was different now, fearful, anticipatory. He was leaving. Naomi's breath caught. She knew what this meant. Carril's fury, the staff's blame, the fragile thread of her survival snapping in an instant. But before she could move, before she could find words that might soothe, a small voice carried across the dining room. "Mommy?" The sound froze her blood. She turned, and there by the kitchen doors stood Isla, her tiny backpack still strapped to her shoulders, her eyes wide as they locked onto the man at table 7. And in that instant, the entire room held its breath. Every sound in the restaurant seemed to collapse into silence. Forks hung in midair. Wine glasses trembled in suspended hands. Even the steady hiss of the kitchen faded, as though the very building had stopped breathing. All eyes turned toward the little girl standing by the kitchen doors, her backpack straps cutting into her small shoulders, her sneakers still faintly glowing from the charge of the walkover. Naomi's heart stuttered in her chest. She felt the blood drain from her face. Isla, her baby. Her promise that tonight she'd be safe, tucked away on Mrs. Patterson's couch with a book and a blanket. But there she was, framed in the glow of the dining room, as out of place as a bird in a gilded cage. "Isla, honey," Naomi whispered, her voice barely audible, her throat tight with panic. "You can't be here." But Isla wasn't looking at her mother. Her wide eyes were locked on the man at table 7. The Japanese guest who stood poised to leave, his coat draped over his arm, his dignity already gathering at the door. Isla took a step forward, then another. The hush deepened with every small movement. The man paused, his gaze falling to the child moving toward him. Something flickered in his face, a shift, a question, a recognition Naomi couldn't name. Then Isla stopped in front of him, her small hands folding at her sides, and with a bow so precise it seemed rehearsed 1,000 times, she lowered her head, gasps scattered like glass breaking. When she lifted her chin, her voice rang clear and confident, carrying to every corner of the room. And she spoke, not in English, not in the half-whispered language of service, but in Japanese. "Good evening, honored guest. Would you like to hear tonight's special selections?" The silence that followed was thunderous. Naomi's tray nearly slipped from her hand. Around the room, mouths fell open. Forks clinked faintly back onto plates. A wine glass tilted until red liquid touched its rim. The man froze, his eyes widening for the first time that evening. His posture, so carefully composed, cracked with surprise. He looked at Isla as though seeing something impossible. Slowly, he lowered his coat back to the chair. His words, when they came, were softer than before, cautious, as if testing the air. "You speak Japanese." Isla smiled shyly but nodded. Yes, sir. My neighbor, Mr. Ito, teaches me. He says I have a good ear for it. Would you like to sit back down? The fish here is very fresh. They flew it in from Boston this morning. Her words were simple, but they landed with the weight of revelation. The man's face transformed, his severity giving way to something warmer, almost tender. He sank back into his chair, the tension in his shoulders dissolving. Naomi's heart pounded. She stood rooted, torn between rushing to scoop her daughter away and standing witness to a moment too extraordinary to break. The room itself had shifted. Where mockery had curled minutes before, now awe stretched wide. The wealthy patrons who sneered at imperfection leaned forward, rapt. A child, a waitress's child, had done what they could not, bridged the silence, turned humiliation into communion. The man gestured to the seat across from him, his words rolling in Japanese once more. Isla turned to Naomi, eyes bright with excitement. Mommy, he wants me to help him order. Can I? Please. Naomi's instincts screamed no. Children didn't belong in dining rooms like this, especially not children of servers, especially not her child, but the millionaire's gaze met hers then, not cold, not dismissive, but steady, expectant, and she realized the room wasn't breathing because it was waiting for her answer. If the gentleman doesn't mind, Naomi's voice cracked despite her effort to keep it level. On the contrary, the man said, switching to English with perfect clarity, his accent delicate but unmistakable. I would be honored. A ripple surged through the dining room. He spoke English, perfect English. He had understood all along. Naomi's breath caught. A murmur rose among the guests, like the beginning of a storm. And as Isla climbed into the chair opposite him, dangling feet swinging above the floor, Naomi realized the night had just cracked wide open. The chandelier light seemed to bend around table 7 now, as if the entire restaurant existed only to witness what was unfolding there. Isla sat straight-backed in the chair, her sneakers swinging just shy of the polished floor. The Japanese millionaire, Mr. Takahashi, Naomi overheard him say, studied her with the kind of intent usually reserved for royalty or boardrooms. Yet his expression had softened, the corners of his mouth lifting into a faint smile that transformed his whole presence. He spoke again in Japanese, his words flowing like water from stone. Isla listened carefully, nodding in places, her forehead creasing with concentration. Then she turned to James, who hovered nearby with his order pad. He says he's interested in the halibut, but he doesn't want cream in the sauce. He would like something lighter, maybe with citrus instead. James blinked. Right, citrus. We can do that. His pen scratched hurriedly, his hand trembling as though the weight of his career rested on a 7-year-old's translation. The diners leaned closer in their seats. Whispers rippled through the room, but this time they weren't laced with scorn. They were tinged with disbelief. Is she fluent? Where did she learn? Unbelievable. Naomi stood a step back, her tray clutched like a shield. Her heart was still racing, though not entirely from fear anymore. She couldn't tear her eyes away from her daughter, her tiny, fearless girl who spoke with grace where adults faltered. Mr. Takahashi asked another question, his tone lighter now, curiosity edging his voice. Isla tilted her head, then relayed it. He wants to know if the vegetables are local and seasonal. He says restaurants lie about that sometimes, but he can always taste the difference. James opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded. Yes, they're local, fresh this week. Isla turned back to Mr. Takahashi, repeating the RDs in Japanese. He gave a slow nod, his eyes crinkling at the edges as he responded. Isla giggled softly. He says he believes you this time, but only because the carrots smell like real earth. A chuckle slipped from a few nearby tables. Even the air seemed to ease, the sharp edge of mockery dulling into reluctant admiration. Then came the wine list. James, still desperate to redeem himself, presented a bottle with the flourish of a magician revealing a final trick. Perhaps the Chateau Margaux, sir. Exquisite vintage. Before he could finish, Mr. Takahashi spoke sharply in Japanese, gesturing toward the bottle, then away. His tone wasn't unkind, but it carried a decisive weight. Ila's eyes widened, then sparkled with mischief. He says this wine is for tourists. He owns a vineyard in Japan, so he knows better. She lowered her voice conspiratorially, though everyone heard. He also says Americans serve white wine too warm. He prefers it at exactly 47 degrees. Gasps and muffled laughter rippled through the room. James flushed crimson, muttered something about checking the cellar, and nearly tripped as he hurried off. The room, once a cage of privilege, was now an audience. Their sneers had turned into fascination. The little black girl in light-up sneakers had become the bridge no one expected, carrying meaning across a divide no one else could cross. Naomi's throat ached with unshed tears. For years she had taught her daughter to hold her head high, to be careful, to be twice as good so she'd never be dismissed. But nothing had prepared her for this. Watching Isla shine, watching her shift the balance of a room full of people who had dismissed her before she even spoke. Mr. Takahashi leaned forward, his gaze soft but unflinching. He said something in Japanese, longer this time, his voice steady, layered with something deeper than orders or pleasantry. As Isla listened, her small brow furrowing as she worked through his words. When she turned to Naomi, her voice carried something more than translation. It carried wonder. "He wants to know, Mommy, if we're happy." The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. The room hushed again. Naomi felt every eye turn toward her, waiting. Her lips parted, but for a moment no sound came. She wanted to say yes, to make it simple, but she saw Isla watching her, saw Takahashi's patient, steady gaze, and she realized the truth mattered more than the performance. "We do our best," she said finally, her voice low but clear. "We're together. That makes us happy." Isla translated, her Japanese words carrying her mother's heart across the table. And for the first time, Naomi saw Takahashi's composure truly break. His eyes softened and the smallest, quietest smile curved his lips, not the mask of wealth or position, but something human. Around them, the diners shifted, unsettled. Because in that moment, it wasn't just dinner anymore. It was something else, something real. And Naomi understood, with a clarity that stole her breath. This night would change everything. The hum of conversation never quite returned after Isla's words. The restaurant had become a stage, and every table leaned toward the drama at its center. Waiters moved more slowly now, their trays hovering longer than necessary, as if afraid to miss even a syllable. Naomi felt it in her bones. The shift. The night was no longer about service or food. It was about something raw, something fragile, unraveling in real time. Mr. Takahashi studied Isla with a gaze that lingered, not on her mistakes, because she made none, but on her courage. Then his eyes drifted to Naomi. For a heartbeat, she thought he might look away, retreat behind the armor of wealth and detachment. Instead, he asked a question in Japanese, his tone quieter, heavy with something Naomi couldn't name. Ila's face softened as she listened. She turned to Ward, her mother, hesitated, then said, "He wants to know about us. About you, Mommy. About why you stopped going to school." Naomi froze. The words lodged in her throat, jagged and sharp. This was not a question asked at restaurants like this, not a story meant for rooms filled with diamonds and disdain. But Takahashi's gaze did not waver. He wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. He was asking as if it mattered. Her hands tightened around her tray until her knuckles ached. She thought of lying, something simple about choices, about paths life takes. But Isla's eyes were on her, too, wide and trusting. And Naomi knew the truth was the only answer that would do. "I was studying hospitality management," she said softly. "I wanted to run a place like this one day. But then life happened." She glanced at Isla, then back to Takahashi. "I had her, and everything changed." Isla translated, her voice carrying her mother's confession into Japanese with remarkable care, her small hands folded neatly on the table. When she finished, silence wrapped around them like a second skin. Takahashi's face shifted. Something broke in him, not visibly, not loudly, but in the way his shoulders lowered, in the flicker of grief that passed through his eyes. He reached slowly into his coat and pulled out his phone. For a moment, he only stared at it. Then, with a kind of reverence, he unlocked the screen and turned it toward Isla. A photo filled the display. A girl, maybe 10 or 11, stood in a school uniform, her violin held proudly in her hands. Her smile was radiant, her eyes alive. "This is my daughter," Takahashi said in English this time, his accent deliberate, every syllable measured. "Her name was Aiko." Naomi's chest tightened. Was. The word carried the weight of a tombstone. Isla leaned forward, her voice hushed with childlike reverence. "She's beautiful. She looks like you." Tak. Ahashi's lips curved, but his eyes shimmered with something deeper than pride. She would have been 17 now, but a drunk driver. His voice cracked on the last word, the grief too sharp to smooth. He drew in a steadying breath. "I built schools, funded programs, poured millions into education hoping it would matter, but none of it filled the emptiness." Naomi felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. Though she blinked them back, she knew loss, though not his kind. She knew what it was to give up everything, to fight every day so her child might have a chance. She recognized the hollow in his voice, the sound of a wound that money could never heal. Ila's small hand reached across the table, resting lightly on Takahashi's wrist. The gesture was so simple, so childlike, yet it cut through the air sharper than any reprimand or polished toast. "I can write to her," Ila whispered, switching briefly into Japanese. "We can send letters. You can tell me stories about her. Maybe she'll hear them." The man's face crumpled for a heartbeat before he regained himself. He nodded slowly, his throat working around words too thick to form. Around them, the diners shifted uncomfortably. Their murmurs, once cruel and dismissive, had fallen into silence. The spectacle they'd come to devour had turned into something too real, too human, to sneer at without shame. Naomi saw it in their faces, the unease of privilege confronted with grief it could not buy its way out of. For the first time that evening, Takahashi looked away from Ila and Naomi to address the room. His voice carried easily, not loud, but strong enough to command attention. "In my country, we say the bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists. Tonight, this child bent toward me when no one else would, and she reminded me that kindness is strength." The words cut through the chandeliers, the linens, the illusions of superiority. And Naomi realized the cracks had spread. The restaurant's careful mask of elegance, of exclusion, of untouchable standards, was shattering before their eyes. But she also knew the night wasn't finished. Something was coming, something bigger than whispers and quiet revelations, something that would change everything. The room had shifted into a strange stillness, the kind that comes after thunder but before the rain. Every face, once smug and composed, was now turned toward table 7, toward the man who had shattered the script and the little girl who had rewritten it. Naomi stood frozen at the edge of the moment, her breath shallow, as if the air itself had thickened. Takahashi rested his phone on the table beside his untouched wine. His eyes swept across the gilded dining room, lingering on faces that moments earlier had sneered or laughed. His words, when they came, were not rushed. They were deliberate, each one laid like a stone in a foundation. "You call this place excellence," he said in English, his voice soft but edged with steel. "But excellence is not chandeliers and imported plates. It is not wine lists and price tags. Excellence is making a stranger feel at home when he cannot find the words." The silence cracked. At table 6, Marcus Whitfield shifted uncomfortably, his cufflinks glinting as he folded his arms. "You misunderstand," he muttered. "This is tradition. Standards." "Standards," Takahashi repeated, tasting the word as if it soured on his tongue. His gaze fixed on Marcus. "Your standards mocked me when you thought I could not understand. Your standards laughed at a child's shoes while you drank from crystal glasses. If this is tradition, then it is built on cruelty, not excellence." A murmur swept the room, sharp and uneasy. Patricia covered her mouth with her hand, but her pearls rattled against her collarbone as if they betrayed her nerves. Naomi's heart raced. This was dangerous ground. The wealthy didn't like to be confronted. Not here, not in their sanctuaries. She wanted to pull Ila back to shield her from the storm she could feel rising, but her daughter sat tall, her hands folded in her lap, unafraid. Takahashi's eyes returned to Naomi, and for a moment his tone softened. "Your daughter has more dignity than anyone in this room tonight. She built a bridge when all of you built walls. That is the measure of wealth, not what we have, but what we give." The words hung heavy, thick with a truth no one wanted to claim. Naomi felt a lump in her throat. She had fought for years to teach Ila her worth, to remind her that kindness was strength, even when the world rewarded cruelty. And now those words echoed back to her, amplified by the voice of a man who commanded boardrooms and fortunes. But the restaurant wasn't ready to surrender. From the far side of the room, Mrs. Hardrove, draped in old money and older arrogance, leaned forward. "This is all very touching," she said, her tone dripping disdain. "But this is a dining establishment, not a daycare. Standards must be kept. Children do not belong in such places." A ripple of agreement moved through a few tables, relief blooming on their faces, as if someone had finally spoken the words they were too polite to say. Naomi's stomach twisted. She braced herself for Takahashi's silence, for the retreat that would surely follow. But he rose instead, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man standing to deliver a verdict. "You speak of standards," he said, his gaze fixed on Mrs. Hardrove, though his voice carried to every corner. "Then let me give you mine. In Japan, we believe children who show skill should be encouraged, not hidden. We believe dignity is owed to every person, Not only those who can afford the price of your menu, and we believe kindness is not weakness, it is the only true strength. The room fell into a hush so complete Naomi could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker into the weight of his words. Isla looked up at him, her small voice carrying across the silence. That's what Mr. Edo says too. He says words are bridges, and tonight, we built one. Naomi's chest ached with pride and fear all at once. Her daughter had no idea how dangerous honesty could be in rooms like this, but Takahashi's face softened again, and he inclined his head. Yes, you built a bridge, and it is stronger than their walls. Naomi sensed the ground beneath them shifting. The balance of power was tilting, away from chandeliers and money, towards something far more fragile and unstoppable, and she knew this was only the beginning. The weight in the air was unbearable now, pressing down on every table, every whispered conversation that dared not rise above the hush. Naomi could feel it in her chest, a tension ready to snap. The chandeliers no longer sparkled. They glared, harsh and unyielding, illuminating truths that no one in that room wanted to see. Mr. Takahashi remained standing, his presence commanding without the need for volume. His words had carved open the evening, but now his silence was sharper still. Every eye was on him, waiting. Even Richard Carroll, the restaurant's owner, lingered near the service station, his face flushed and tight, torn between groveling and lashing out. Finally, Takahashi reached into his jacket pocket. For a moment, the gesture was so ordinary, just a man retrieving something, that no one stirred. But when he pulled out a slim, leather-bound checkbook and a sleek silver pen, the room seemed to jolt awake. Gasps spread like wildfire. Naomi's breath caught. What was he doing? He placed the checkbook on the table, flipped it open, and began to write with calm precision. The scratch of pen against paper was the only sound in the restaurant, each stroke of ink a countdown to something none of them understood. When he finished, he tore the check neatly, placed it on the linen tablecloth, and tapped it once with his finger. $14.7 million, he said, his voice clear and level. The market value of this restaurant based on recent district sales. I can buy it tonight. The room erupted in a collective gasp. Forks clattered. Someone choked on a sip of wine. Naomi's knees nearly buckled beneath her, her tray digging into her palms. Richard Carroll stumbled forward, his practiced charm cracking into panic. Mr. Takahashi, you can't be serious. This is a performance, a gesture. Takahashi turned his gaze on him, unblinking. Do I look like a man who gestures? Carroll's mouth opened, then shut again. The millionaire's eyes swept across the room, pausing on Mrs. Hardrove, on Marcus Whitfield, on every polished face that had smirked or sneered only minutes earlier. You believe wealth gives you the right to define standards, he said. But tonight has proven wealth without character is nothing but noise. So yes, I will buy this restaurant. And when I do, it will not be a palace of exclusion. It will be a place where dignity speaks every language. The murmurs exploded again, some in disbelief, others in outrage. Patricia Whitfield let out a shrill laugh, clutching her pearls. You're mad. A foreigner waltzing in here to lecture us on dignity? This is America. Naomi felt her throat tighten, anger flaring beneath her fear. But before she could speak, Takahashi did, quietly, cutting through Patricia's laughter like a blade. Yes, and it is your America that showed me tonight what happens when arrogance mistakes itself for tradition, but arrogance ends now. Then he did something Naomi could never have anticipated. He turned, lifted the check, and placed it directly into her hand. Her fingers shook as the weight of the paper settled in her palm, her mind refusing to comprehend what it meant. This place was built on the backs of people like you, Takahashi said, his gaze steady on Naomi. Invisible hands, perfect smiles, unseen sacrifices. If I buy it, it will not be for them. He gestured toward the glittering guests. It will be for you, for her. His eyes flicked toward Isla, who sat in her chair, wide-eyed but calm, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. Naomi's voice cracked as she whispered, I can't. I don't. You already have, Takahashi interrupted softly. You showed me more grace tonight than this entire room combined, and your daughter reminded me that bridges, once built, cannot be undone. The check trembled in her hand. 14.7 million, more money than she could fathom. More responsibility than she had ever dreamed. Around her, the elite erupted into chaos. Protests, disbelief, sharp laughter that sounded more like panic. Corral turned red, shouting about contracts and leases. Mrs. Hardrove demanded to know what authority this man thought he had, but none of it mattered, because Naomi knew the truth. For the first time in her life, the power was not theirs. It was hers and Isla's. And as Takahashi bowed slightly to her, respect shining in his eyes, Naomi realized the night had already broken every rule. The final reveal wasn't the check in her hand, it was the truth echoing through her chest. They weren't invisible anymore. The restaurant was no longer a sanctuary of wealth. It had become a battlefield. Voices clashed like cymbals, shouts of protest, gasps of disbelief, whispers sharp as knives. The chandeliers overhead glittered too brightly now, their crystals catching the frenzy below like stage lights on a play unraveling. Naomi stood frozen, the check trembling in her hand. $14.7 million. She could feel the ink bleeding into her skin, not literally, but in weight, in meaning. Every choice she had ever made, the long shifts, the quiet humiliations, the nights spent balancing bills with trembling fingers, seemed to converge into this moment. Her pulse hammered so loud she barely heard the storm around her. Richard Carryle lunged forward, his mask of charm shattered, sweat beading on his forehead. "You think you can just take what I've built?" His voice cracked with a desperation that silenced even the gasps around him. "This is my restaurant, my reputation. You don't know what it cost me to make this place what it is." Takahashi turned toward him, his expression calm, almost pitying. "The cost of a reputation built on fear and exploitation is always more than it's worth. You mistook control for respect, and tonight, you've lost both." Kirill's face twisted, his words tumbling into anger. "She's just a waitress," he spat, his finger stabbing toward Naomi. "She doesn't belong at the center of this. She doesn't belong." But before the insult could finish, Isla slid off her chair. Her small sneakers tapped against the floor as she stepped between her mother and Carryle. Her voice, though soft, cut through the noise with startling clarity. "My mommy belongs anywhere she chooses, because she's stronger than anyone in this room." The silence that followed was electric. Naomi's heart clenched as her daughter's hand slipped into hers, steady and sure. Takahashi's voice calm. Read into the hush, firm and final. "Your daughter has spoken more truth in a single sentence than this room has heard in years." He turned back to the diners, his gaze sweeping them like a judge surveying the condemned. "And let me be clear, this is not charity, this is not performance, this is investment, in dignity, in integrity, in a future that does not confuse cruelty with tradition." Mrs. Hardrove rose abruptly, her pearls trembling against her chest. "This is madness. You can't just hand power to... She stopped herself, but the venom in her tone filled the gap she dared not say aloud. Takahashi's eyes locked on hers, his voice lowered, quiet enough to force the room to lean in. "You measure power by what it keeps. I measure it by what it gives. That is why your kind will always cling to chandeliers while the world changes without you." The diners shifted uneasily, their illusions collapsing under the weight of truth spoken aloud. Some lowered their gazes, others muttered excuses, but the power was gone from them, siphoned into the little girl with braids and light-up sneakers, and the woman who had carried invisible trays for too long. Naomi's throat tightened. She wanted to cry, to laugh, to scream, but all she could do was hold onto Isla's hand, and the impossible check still clutched in her trembling fingers. Then Takahashi did something no one expected. He bowed, deeply, reverently, first to Naomi, then to Ila. The act sent a shockwave through the room. A Japanese millionaire bowing not to senators or tycoons, but to a black waitress and her child. When he rose, his voice carried with it the weight of finality. "Tonight, dignity has spoken, and it will not be silenced again." With that, he placed his coat over his arm, turned, and walked toward the door. Every step was measured, every movement calm, as if the chaos behind him no longer existed. "Naomi." I stood rooted, the check in her hand burning with possibility. Isla leaned against her side, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Mommy, are we free now?" Naomi looked down at her daughter, at the fierce little girl who had built bridges with words and courage. The room around them was still buzzing, the elite still reeling, but Naomi felt something stronger than fear for the first time in years. "Yes, baby," she said, her voice breaking into a smile through tears she could no longer hold back. "We're free." And as the chandeliers glittered above a dining room stripped of its illusions, Naomi understood the truth. Freedom had never been about wealth. It had always been about voice. And tonight, hers had finally been heard.